Hello, I'm Chris Flisher, and welcome to Turning of the Wheel, an intelligent, lively discussion about astrology, art, and spiritual adventure. Timing is everything, and as the great wheel turns, we are best prepared when we are best informed. Join me as I explore concepts that allow us to broaden our view of the world. You'll hear interesting topics, meet fascinating guests, and discover who you really are. Using the time-tested practices of astrology, you'll learn how to accept change as the great wheel of life turns. Astrology, art, and spiritual adventure on Turning of the Wheel TV with Chris Flisher. Hey, welcome to Turning of the Wheel. My name is Chris Flisher, and this is a show about astrology, art sometimes, and spiritual adventure. These are all topics that I find it to be all connected in some way because they have a capacity amongst them to sort of give us logic and purpose and reason for being on the planet. And one of the key components of it all that sort of ties the room together is the astrology chart. And the astrology chart is based on your time of birth, your place of birth, and the date of birth. We've talked about this in the past. These are important characteristics. And people are fascinated by astrology. Not many people admit it, but they do have a certain fascination for it. There's a statistic I think I read somewhere recently that said 97% of the world knows their birth sign. So that shows that there's a real interest in there. And they do read their astrology reports or their astrology, weekly, daily, monthly astrology. So I want to just do some brief lessons. This is part of the goal here, is to sort of enlighten you and educate you about certain characteristics of astrology, because it's a fairly complicated science. You've got 10 planets, you've got 12 houses, you've got 12 signs, and you take just the mathematical permutations of that alone, and you've got quite a bit of things that happen in there. Then you bring into it the way the planets interact with each other, and it gets to be very complicated. But one thing I can say without reservation is that it is completely accurate. When I first came to astrology years ago, I was very skeptical. I said, there's no way this could be possible. But I know that over time, I have learned, tested it, and I still am skeptical at times, but I know it is absolutely accurate. And what I'm going to do is gradually I'm going to be going through all the different planets, and today we're going to talk about the planet Mars. Now, we all know that we start out with the Sun. We have the Moon, obviously. We have Mercury, we have Venus, we have Mars, we have Jupiter, we have Saturn, we have Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. And Pluto, by the way, is a planet in the world of astrology. There's not a single astrologer in the world who would not say Pluto is a part of it. And the reason we're so adamant about Pluto and its discovery and its role in the astrological makeup is that it's such a key player. It's really a very, very important player and an indicator of where a person has a certain amount of reconstruction in their life. And this is always the case. And it also has a very strong karmic link to the Pluto. But I'm not going to talk about Pluto today. Interestingly enough, though, the planet I am going to talk about is Mars. That's the one that's over there in the back behind me. And the reason I'm talking about Mars is because, and I should be wearing red because Mars is the planet of war and aggression, and that is the most appropriate. But I'm wearing blue today to sort of soften that Mars. Now, I'm an Aries, so therefore Mars is my ruling planet. I'm very keen about Mars, okay? And I want to tell you a little bit of a story. Years ago, and the reason why Mars is important, years ago there was a very famous astrologer named Mark Edmund Jones. And coincidentally, he was a Presbyterian minister, which is kind of unusual because not many people who are involved in the religious business adopt astrology or believe in astrology. But he did. He was fascinated by it. He lived out in L.A., very colorful character. And he devised a system for interpreting astrology charts. He was one of the forerunners of traditional contemporary astrology. And those, I do mean it in that way, traditional and contemporary, because astrology is a traditional science, but it's been brought into a contemporary world where we are now. So, he was speaking at a astrological society in New York City in around 1920, 1929, something in that era, right before the Depression, I think, right around that time. And he was giving a talk on 17 steps to interpreting an astrology chart. So you have to begin somewhere and you have to end somewhere. So his theory at the time was the first planet he looks at is the planet Mars in the chart of the individual. Now when I say a chart, I mean everybody has a chart where all their planets are. he always looks at Mars first. Now, most astrologers would say sun, and then look at the moon, and then look at the ascendant or the rising sign as the three-legged stool that sort of supports the individual and gives the person character and stuff. And that's very accurate. But the reason he looked at Mars got me thinking. And then the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. Because Mars is the planet, even though it's associated with war and red and anger and all those things, those are sort of the attributes that we associate with Mars. It is also the planet of ambition. It's the planet of motive. It's the planet of aggression. Matter of fact, I always call it the A planet because all the A words apply to it. Ambition, activity, anger, aggression, all of those words apply. Aspiration, ascension, they all apply. The reason I think that he sees this as an important piece of the astrology chart is because if you understand the motive of an individual, you understand what makes them get out of bed in the morning, you're going to know what that person's all about. If you're motivated to get out of bed and play the piano all day long, you're obviously a musician. If you're motivated to go and work in a bank, obviously you're motivated towards money. If you're motivated to talk about astrology, obviously you're interested in astrology. You get the point. It points out the motive. Now you say to yourself, how do we know how I can determine that? By looking at an astrology chart. I look at an astrology chart, I find where Mars is, I find the sign that it's in, I find the house that it's in, and then I can begin to correlate a picture of an individual and what their motives are. This is very, very accurate. And I'm going to use myself as an example because I know exactly what this is all about. I actually have Mars in one of its rulers, which is Scorpio. A very interesting placement because Scorpio tends to be, it's co-ruled by Mars and by Pluto. But in this case, I'm going to stick to the Aries piece of it because that's who I am. So it's Scorpio. Mars and Scorpio. So in Scorpio, and it's in my third house. Third house is the house of communication. Interesting. What am I doing right now? I'm a communicator. I write, I talk on the radio, I have television shows. This is how this is what I do. I communicate. This is what my motive is. My motive is to communicate. I'm a communicator, a writer, a published author, a speaker, radio host. All of these things are expressive forms of communication. This is what Mars is to me. But more importantly, Mars is when you know what the person's motive is. In my case, it's that communication piece. When you know the person's motive, you have a great deal of idea of what that person is. What makes that person operate? Now, in astrology, most people would point to the sun and the moon and the rising sign, as I said. Or, you could say, if such and such a person is a Gemini, well, we know that they're talkative and they're communicative and they like to do a lot of things at a lot of times. It's very much of a typical Gemini trait. Aries, very much of a forceful person. They go charging into things. They're impulsive. They're impatient. Taurus, slow and methodical, steadfast, earthbound, lover of luxury. Cancer, nurturer, home environment. Leo, the big bold Leo, the big Bill Clintons of the world. They get out there with all their charisma. Virgos are the accountants and the people who keep books and stuff like that straight. They're very detail-oriented and meticulous in their qualities. Libras are the beauticians. They're the ones that run the beauty salons. They're the artists. They're the ones that have this wonderful sense of aesthetics. Very much the case. Scorpios are the very intense people. They're the ones that get involved with deep research. They're the ones that are not afraid of death. They don't shy away from any form of death at all. They are fascinated with all topics that are dealing with redemption and rebirth and sort of regeneration. This is very much of a Scorpio trait. Sagittarians love to travel. They will travel in a heartbeat. Wanderlust is their name. They just take off and travel the world over. They're also known for being educators. They're very good in the classroom. So that's very much of a case for them. Capricorns are the most stable, work-oriented sign in the whole zodiac. No one is more dependable than a Capricorn. You want to get a job done, give it to a Capricorn. They are tried and true, they are methodical, they understand, and they get the job done. Aquarians have this great, large, sort of global view of the world. They're the people who are very unconcerned with themselves, but very much involved with the global stage. They love big global themes. Two famous Aquarians come to mind, Franklin Roosevelt and Abraham Lincoln, both of whom were Aquarians. You look at the work that they did, you can see that their reach was all about helping humanity move forward. And then lastly, we have Pisces. Pisces are the dreamers. They're sort of the lofty theologians sometimes. You often see them in theology, and they're very spiritually oriented, deep, intuitive, artistic people as well. And so when you look at all of these different signs, then you find the different planets and how the planets work into that. And when Mars falls in one of those signs, we know it's going to be taking a certain characteristic of that. Now, the reason I talk about Mars is because it's ruled by Aries. I'm an Aries. Obviously, I feel comfortable there. It's exalted in the sign of Capricorn. It's in its detriment in Libra and Taurus, in that area. And it's in its fall in Cancer, meaning it's not as effective. Those are astrological terms that I'll go over with when I have a guest and we can elaborate on it more. But for the time being, I just want to talk about that. The reason it is important is that it's this whole concept of motivation. People who are motivated in certain ways manifest their lives and live their lives in certain ways. Now, if we look at famous people, we can see where the motivation lies in them. And oftentimes people have what's called difficult charts. And that's the word I'm going to use rather than getting into explaining it right now. I'm just going to say there are difficult charts. And the chart is like the road map. It's sort of what I think of the astrology chart as an owner's manual. And you see the layout of the chart of the individual. And if you haven't seen an astrology chart, I'll bring one in and I'll show you what it looks like, because it's really fascinating. And if you're familiar with it, you'll understand exactly what's going on. You'll see the astrology chart as a roadmap, a vision into who you are. It's your fingerprint. It is your DNA. You were born at a place and time with certain characteristics. And the reason this Mark Edmund Jones did this, made this distinction about Mars being the most important planet, was because he saw it as a driver. A driver. Remember the words I used to describe Mars, all the A words: action, ambition, aggression, anger, ascension, aspiration. All those A words. They respond to moving things forward. It's a planet of motion. It's a planet of motive. It's about moving and doing things. When I look at an astrology chart, I have, every astrologer has their own way of reading a chart. You could put 3 astrologers in a room, give them one chart, and they would all approach it differently. But they would all come to a point in time where it all made sense, and they'd all have interesting characteristics that all worked together. Because astrology is fascinating in that regard, because you can take 3 people and put them together. I suppose, when you think about it, it really is the first psychology. Before psychology was invented or given a term or a word or a name, it really was a study of human characteristics. And when you study human characteristics, you get a better feel for it. And one of the fascinating things about astrology, I think, is that the more informed we are about it and about ourselves, the better we can act to make our lives better. Because our ultimate goal is to work towards the instructions that are given to us at that point in time. We all come into this life with a set of characteristics that we inherit from our parents, from their parents, sort of like that bloodline, that DNA. And as humanity evolves and people gather more information, each generation is smarter than the one before. And there's this whole new batch of information that comes in. That is based on the evolution of mankind. But when we know who we are and what we're doing, we can best work to that. Oftentimes, I think, astrology, people typically come to me when they are in need or in trouble because they're trying to figure out what is going wrong with their life. Most people have issues in their lives about certain characteristics, certain things. They're not getting along with their husband or their wife, or their boyfriend's not right, or their boss is not getting along with them. People have conflict in life. And I would go so far as to say that without conflict, life would be pretty boring. Most of us would like to have easy lives, there's no question about it. But that's not really necessarily what's going to happen. We are all here to learn something, I believe, at some point in time. We're here to learn something. The more we know about each other, and the more we understand about each other, the easier our lives are. I think one of the clearest points in view about this is the fact that because astrology is so exact, is so accurate, and is so granular in its precision and its accuracy, that if we all were well versed in understanding astrology, if it was, say, if it was offered as a class like it is in college or like a psychology class is, if it was offered as a class, we would be able to understand other people much better in a heartbeat, in a very quick glance, if you understood the nature of astrology. And I teach classes on it at the local school, so if it's interesting, you can find out more about it. But when you know this amount of information, it allows us, and this is, I think, one of the ultimate treasures and gems of astrology, it allows us to understand people as a nature-based organism. In other words, they were born this way. You know, you can't change the way you were born. You can't change your birth circumstances. You can't change your parents. These are constants. They're part of our lives. As a result of that, they become, the characteristics of the astrology chart become characteristics that we are imbued with. They are embedded in part of our DNA. They're sort of our operating manual. Like I said, there are marching orders. There are instructions. Some people are meant to be great writers. Some people are meant to be musicians. Some people are meant to repair plumbing. Some people are meant to be fantastic chefs. Some people are meant to be wonderful teachers. Everybody has a skill set. And when you know that skill set, especially if you were able to find a way to get into teaching kids about this at an early age, think of the guidance that you could help them with. Interestingly enough, I have many clients who've come to me. I spoke with a client just the other day. He was from South Africa. And I had spoken with him. He was actually German by descent, but he was living in South Africa at the time. And I went through and read his chart. And what I do when I read a chart is I don't ask them for any information. I don't want any information. I just want to be able to prove that astrology works by approaching the astrology chart without any background information. I just want those 3 data points: the sun, the day of birth, the time of birth, and the place of birth. When I know that, I begin to look at it. So I'm looking at his chart. And I said, you know something, you really are a very talented person. You've got a great sense of intuition. You'd be wonderful in a creative field. You work in a fantastic area of film and photography, and theater would be a wonderful opportunity for you. Fantastic. You're a natural. You've got a Pisces moon. You've got Neptune and Mercury and in your 10th house, which is your occupation. So I thought of him as being a filmmaker because he's got that characteristics. And I know you don't know astrology, so I'm just going to go through this quickly. But when I started talking to him, he said, "Oh my God." And I said, "What's the matter?" He says, "Well, you know something? I'm just now doing that in my life." And I said, "What do you mean?" He says, "Well, my parents wanted me to be a lawyer." And I said, "You're kidding me." He said, "No, my parents wanted me to be a lawyer." So I went on and I went to law school, and I couldn't stand it. Perfect example of somebody who was misguided in their life to do something for the wrong reason. He was doing this to satisfy his father, but his real skill, his universe-given gift, was to be a photographer and work in the film industry. To be filming and working with this sort of this, you know, illusionary aesthetic of time. And, you know, he was working in this world of, you know, film. Film is an illusion, if you think about it. You know, theater, movies, those are all illusion. You know, we see all the things that we see in the movie theaters. But he spent his life as a lawyer, or up to that point. He was about 45, 40, 43, 44, something like that, years old. But, interestingly enough, around 42, he said the heck with it. And he walked away from a legal practice, a very lucrative job that he had, making good money, and went on to become an independent filmmaker. And you know that he's probably struggling, because anybody who's independent anything struggles unless you're, you know, selling food as an independent person. You know, it's very difficult to make it as an independent craftsman in this modern technology, in this modern world. But he is following his heart. Think about it. If he had been told that when he was younger, growing up, if he had been told that this is what your motive is, your real true motive is here, based on the placement of Mars in his chart and other planets at the same time, he would have been able to say, the heck with law school. I'm not going to go to law school. I'm going to go on and become this individual person. Now, The way astrology works is that people are often pushed into situations in their lives, be it family pressure, peer group pressure, circumstances. Some people are not fortunate enough, they have to make decisions based on survival. All kinds of other things get involved with this. But if he had known this about himself when he was younger, maybe he would have taken a different tact in life. Maybe he would have approached life differently. Maybe he would have reached out and made different connections. But he didn't know that. And if you think of the human being as a clock, as a good analogy, like a cuckoo clock. So you got all these little wheels spinning around. Some wheels are spinning very fast and some wheels are spinning very slow. And there's other wheels that are spinning even slower. These are like the planetary cycles. And as they spin, they begin to align. When they align at a certain point in time, click, ding, the cuckoo bird comes out and the person arrives. The reason I use the analogy of the cuckoo bird, the cuckoo clock rather, is because it signifies a point in time when people arrive. Everybody arrives at a different point in time, and that is based on their motivation and the way the other planets are in their charts. Some people, Michael Jackson for example, 5 years old, he's on television dancing with his brothers, an amazing success at 5 years old. 5 years old. His cuckoo clock struck at 5 years old. Other people, on the other extreme, there's a British author, playwright named George Bernard Shaw. He didn't get his first book published until he was 94 years old. 94 years old, and he got his first book published after writing his whole life. This is about the timing characteristic. But if you looked at those charts, if you looked at their astrological outlay, you would see the characteristics that were there. You'd be able to guide them and say, you know, something. And the thing is that because you would know this knowledge ahead of time, you could make significant decisions based on the accuracy of your chart. This is where it becomes fascinating, absolutely fascinating. You would be able to say, there's things that you can do at a certain point in time that would help you on your true path. Not everybody gets that wake-up call, and they spend their lives wondering, where did I go wrong? Gee, I always wanted to be a dressmaker. I always wanted to be an artist. Always wanted to play in a band, and I just passed it up. Why is that? Why do people make those choices? Largely because they're trying to satisfy other people, and they're not being true to themselves. One thing astrology will do, it will show you your motive. It'll show you what drives you, what your real, true inner flame is. There's always that inner flame, that sort of that burning desire to do something. And if it is writing, then they should be a writer. If it's communicating, they should communicate. If it's building houses, then you want to be a builder. All of these things are important to understand, and the astrology chart will bring that into you. That's why I'm trying to educate you about that. Each planet has a characteristic. We happen to be talking about Mars today, that planet over there. And Mars represents motivation. It also represents the warrior. So, you think about it. When people go to war, they're motivated. There's something that is sparking them on to go to war. And Mars oftentimes gets that a bad rap because they think of it archetypally and metaphorically. It's considered to be aggressive and pushy. And it rules, you know, it's like Aries. It rules Aries, and Aries rules the first house. And the first house is the house of self. It's a house of ego. So you think about it. What's pushing these people? What's the motivation behind them? And when you talk about the motivation, you understand that individual. That's a very strong person. And some people are more motivated than others, you have to admit. Many people are very happy to sit back on their sofa and watch TV all day and do nothing. Other people have a burning desire. That I can tell you in a minute when I read an astrology chart. And Mars is the reason, what motivates them. It's important to understand these characteristics. In other segments, I'm going to be going through all the planets because they all have a significant characteristic that's relevant to the individual. If you know where those planets are, you're able to live your life to its fullest, to be who you are supposed to be. This is what it happens. And oftentimes people waste their lives wondering why they didn't do certain things. I'm sure there's many of you out there who are wondering, why am I doing what I'm doing? Now obviously, the whole concept I mentioned about the clock has other things that come involved. We have children, we have mortgages, we have car payments, all these other things come into our lives, and sometimes things get postponed. The person I was talking about, who was a lawyer, he didn't have those things over his head, so he was fine. But other people do have those things over their head, and they do postpone them. But that is all part of the natural process of unfolding as an individual. As you unfold as an individual, those characteristics come into play and you see. Now, granted, I had children, I had a mortgage, I have a mortgage, have car payments, all those things, and yet when my children were smaller, I was doing a different occupation. But ultimately, I wanted to be this, and this is what I became because it's in my chart. And I knew this from when I was very young, that I was going to do this. I could tell by looking at my astrology map, my roadmap, my owner's manual, I could tell this was going to be the case. I knew this was going to happen. But the timing of it was critical, and astrology can bring that timing piece to it. Remember I was talking about Mars. Mars is the great motivator. It's the planet that's right over there that gives us the planets and gives us the opportunity to be motivated. So this is why that man, Mark Edmund Jones, that I first was talking about in the beginning, this is why he looks at Mars as a key significant planet in the chart, because it's the motivator. And the person whose chart he was reading at the time was none other than Theodore Roosevelt. And Theodore Roosevelt was an action man, if ever there was an action man. This is a guy who went down to the Amazon, he went charging up. He was a real motivated person, incredibly motivated person. And so the reason I think this man came up with this rules for how to interpret an astrology chart was based on that idea. It was based on what is it that motivates the individual. And then you go on from that point and you look at the sun and the moon and other parts of the characteristics of the chart. But Mars is the motivator. Think of it. If you know where your Mars is, if you know what motivates an individual, you will know what makes that person get out of bed, whether it's to be a plumber, whether it's to be an opera singer, whether it's to be a composer, whether it's to be a famous chef, or maybe it's just to be a school bus driver. Not everybody has the same skill sets. Everybody's born into it. Some people have incredibly difficult birth charts, that's what I would say. They're born with a lot of trauma in their life. But growth does come through adversity. When we have difficult times and we rise to those challenges, our character is built, we learn to survive, and we move on. The most interesting people I've ever met in my life are people who are very complex. They've got a lot of stuff happening. That's not to say that they're always easy people, but they are complex and they're interesting because they've got a certain sense of richness. They've lived, they've walked through life in a certain way. They understand a certain hardship. And from that hardship, there comes a certain appreciation for life as well. Very critical piece. Very important. So each week, I'm going to try to give you a new planet. This week, it was Mars. Mars is the planet. It's ruled by Aries, and Aries rules the first house of the astrology. And the first house is the house of self. So that is the house of motivation. I think that's part of the reason why Mark Edmund Jones chose that as his thing, as his main planet. It's the first planet. It's the one that is the driver. It's sort of the one, you have to start somewhere, right? Everything needs a beginning. And it needs something to start. And what is it that starts that? It is the motivation. Motivation in the astrology, in the world of astrology, is represented by the planet Mars. It's what gives us our drive. It's what gives us our raison d'etre, a reason to be. It's what does and what works. It's fascinating to watch it. And then as Mars moves around the planets of your chart, it takes on a new meaning. And I'll get into that in other segments. But remember, as the great wheel turns, we are best prepared when we are best informed. Thank you, and I hope you continue to watch the show and learn about astrology because you will understand what a fascinating tool it is and how rich the imagery is and how valuable what you get from it can bring to your life. Incredible accuracy. I will talk to you all soon. Take care.